Welcome back. You're watching Credlin. It sadly comes as no surprise to learn that Australian students continue to languish behind their counterparts in other countries around the world. Our standards are in free fall. But the latest NAPLAN student results have caused major alarm, and it's about time. The number of Year 9 boys not reaching the minimum achievement standards is at its worst level in more than a decade. Basic spelling and literacy, well, they're falling across the board. These are damning results, and they are a national shame. Well, joining me now is the Program Director in Education Policy at the Centre for Independent Studies, Glenn Fahey. Glenn, welcome to Credlin. I can't dress it up any other way. These results are pretty damning. Take us through what we now know.
Well, good to be with you, Cory. Regular viewers of the show may well remember that we were in exactly the same place this time last year talking about the same issue. Now, it's not a new one, but the discrepancy we see in NAPLAN between boys and girls in literacy is truly representative of an educational crisis, and one that the equity advocates in education really seem to have a blind spot on.
Well, the challenge is, we've been through this dance before, as you point out, and it's a continuing diminishing returns. And I want to get to this gender gap in a second, as you call it. But there are people who are saying that COVID has had an impact on what's happened in the last 12 months or so. How do you respond to that? Has the impact been felt by students?
Look, there's no doubt that in some cases COVID certainly has had an impact upon students' experiences, but to date the evidence just does not point us consistently to show that there's been educational harm done when it comes to academic outcomes. That in some respects is really good news, but it also means that COVID can't be used as an educational scapegoat for outcomes that are poor. The poor learning outcomes are the result of a learning loss that's been 2 decades in the making, not one that's related to the pandemic.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's been 2 decades in the making. Now, you have written about the gender literacy gap. You referred to it just a couple of moments ago. Explain that to my viewers, and can you give us a synopsis about what you think needs to be done?
Look, it's understandable that we want all students to be able to succeed. Ultimately, we want to see students, regardless of their gender, do well. I think that goes without saying. But what we have identified over recent decades has been a lot of energy and attention focused upon the gender gap we observe in mathematics and in STEM. And this is where boys do tend to outperform girls. And if we look at the Australian data, at Year 9, NAPLAN tells us that boys achieve around 5 months ahead of where girls are at in numeracy. And that's something we might well say that's an issue that we may want to see those gaps alleviated. However, there's a much greater equity gap that doesn't get anywhere near that same attention. That's the gap in reading and in writing. When we look at reading results, again in Year 9, NAPLAN tells us that the average boy is around a year behind the average girl, and in writing that's approaching 2 years. There's more than 1 in 5 boys in Year 9 who don't reach the national minimum standard in writing. Now, these students will have significant difficulty when it comes to being able to clearly express themselves and understand written texts in the kind of way we know is essential if they're going to have any hope of being successful in future employment or future study.
So we've thrown tens of billions of dollars in additional funding over the years at getting better results. It's not working. What do we need to do to turn around Australian students' performance?
Well, you know what's really revealing is that our friends at the teachers' unions have been busy trying to napalm NAPLAN all these years. Now, NAPLAN is exactly the instrument that highlights to us the areas that need greater attention. And one of those is genuinely this literacy gap we see with boys. Now, just in the last 2 weeks, there have been some really significant reports from policymakers that have missed this elephant in the room. Now, there was the Productivity Commission. It looked at equity groups that require additional needs. It made no mention of the gender gap that we see in literacy. And a landmark report just in the last few weeks looked at writing standards, and it had some damning results. But it too did not specifically look at this issue of underachievement of boys, despite the statistics I've already laid out. And it tells me that there's a real blind spot of policymakers on this particular issue. How do we fix this? Well, It turns out that boys seem to be disproportionately impacted by two of the things that we know impact upon students' learning negatively. That's inquiry learning. This is teaching that's not led by teachers, but led by students. And classrooms that don't really look like the classrooms that you or I are familiar with. These are more what we'll call open space learning environments, where students are not sitting face to the front, they're faced towards each other. So there's very little opportunity for them to actually learn from a teacher effectively. And this seems to impact boys more than girls, simply because boys tend to be overrepresented in those students with have behavioural and attentional challenges. Inquiry learning and so-called innovative classrooms, these seem to really harm boys' learning.
Yeah, I'm testimony to boys are easily distracted while at school. Glenn Fahey, thank you for joining us tonight, and I appreciate you sharing your insights.